Hey there, following from that recent video about Bespoke Experience, I've literally rolled up my sleeves to get to work on this because this must be ready within a week. And so I just wanted to get this in because for the rest of this time I'm going to be far too busy to do this, to do videos. So I've unrolled the cloth. The customer texted me this morning, said, hey, thanks for telling me to go away and have a pint and think about it, because he changed his pleating style. I've made note of that. I had measured him a second time when he came last night, because, and again, his measurements had changed ever so slightly. So what I've done, looking at the cloth, I've unrolled the cloth, you can see that it looks like it's a bit uneven. You see how it's pulled like that. Now, in some occasions and sometimes, as with other bespoke tailors, they'll let this, after the cloth has been bought, after it's been woven for them, they'll let it sit and rest, and it'll sort of smooth itself out. But in this case, because we've got some irregularities here, it's been pulled. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be stretching this, spritzing it, stretching it with an iron to stretch everything back into shape. You see it wobbles that way, so I'm going to be stretching and pulling and manipulating it to get that front pattern completely smooth, because that's the front apron. It's less critical in here where the pleats are, but it's also critical on the inner apron. So what I've done, I've taken his measurements, 32 waist and a 40 hip, 32 and a 40. Now the question is, how do we divide between the apron and the pleats? So basically what I do is I start looking here. I start with each of these is waist and then hip. Looking down here is I start at 50%, so 16 and 16, and because my aprons tend to not have a huge A-line, as long as they keep adding up to 32 and 40, and then I'm gonna just play with these numbers a little bit. So I'm gonna go 17 and 15, 18 and 24. I'm going to go 18, 14, 19, 23. I'm going to go 19, 13, 20, 20. Now I'm looking ahead because he's quite lean, but his figure's going to coarsen. We want this kilt to last for his entire life. So I've hit upon 18 and 19 for the apron, 14 and 23 for the pleats, because again his figure's going to coarsen. And possibly because my first training was as an army kilt maker, where the apron is substantially larger than the pleated portion. And in any case, we don't want to go smaller than a third, which is about the point of the hips. So as this fellow, as his stature, shall we say, increases over the next 40 or 50 years, we want the kilt to be able to modify to keep pace with it. So I've gone with 18 and 19, and then I've chalked everything out. On the front apron, I've gone the length. I've marked it. I've marked the fell, which is 7 inches, so I've marked that up from, or sorry, down from the top of the kilt. The buckle and strap, which is 2.5 inches. The waist, 18. The hip, 19. Now I'm doing this very quickly, and I will cover this more exhaustively when I have a bit more time. I've also, as you've seen here, I've marked the center element of the apron with an arrow, because as I referred earlier about laying on when I sat the top band. So I've done that for the inside apron. I've gone all the way to the other end and done the same thing for the inner apron. And at the inner apron, I've chosen a different center feature. The front of the kilt, the outside apron was the red line. The inside apron is going to be the black line. Can't really rationalize that right now. I think it's as a result of circumstances where the size of the plaid or the size of the set was such that we could do it no other way. But it also, switching that center line means that I can move the apron in a little bit, because I'm giving myself a little extra cloth here. So I've got the allowance for the end of the apron plus slightly extra allowance for the fringes I'm going to put on. So I've done the same thing here. I've chalked the inner apron. I've figured out exactly how deep my apron pleat's going to be. I always do deep apron pleats, and they're going to be 1/3 to 1/4 of the total width of the apron. So fortuitously, that is this white line here. So I've chalked that to show that that is my indice, shall we say. And this I've chalked to show that this is the final pleat that'll come to there, and then the apron will come to there. So having chalked that, and I've done the same, marked the same allowance for the apron on the outer side, now I count the pleats. And I've already done that, so I'm just going to carry on folding it neatly. It turns out that this kilt is going to have 29 pleats. So I start playing with the numbers. If I've got 29 pleats, so 1/2 inch, 5/8, 3/4, 7/8, 1. Well, a 1 inch pleat's going to be 1, isn't it? And a 1/2 inch pleat, I should explain a bit. In 29 pleats, 29 times 1/2 inch, 14.5, 29 times 1, 1 inch. And then working with my tape, I fill in the rest of these numbers. Now I will show you this at length in a later video, but basically to determine 5/8, there's 14.5, I count 8 29 times. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, as you see here, all the way, and I get to 18 1/8. To count, to see how many 3/4 is, I take 14.5 and I count 29 quarters. I come up with 21 3/4, 7/8. I wind up with 25 3/8. Now I take a look at these numbers and I look at my division between the apron and the pleats. If my apron is 18 inches at the waist, it's 14 inches across the pleats. So a 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch is 14.5. That's close enough. We're going to go with that. My apron is going to be 19, therefore my hip is going to be, sorry, the pleats are going to be 23 at the hip. Well, 23 lands between 3/4, which is 21 3/4, and 7/8, which is 25 3/8, somewhere in between there. I'm not going to count in 32nds or 16ths or 64ths or anywhere else. What I'm going to do is, because I've made these little wooden shims, they're the right width for, this one's 3/8, but if I measure to the outside of the chalk, I've got 1/2 inch. And this one's 3/4. If I measure to the outside of the chalk, it's just about exactly right. It is 3/4 plus, let's say, a 1/16. So that's going to work out very nicely. What I have to remember, though, is that with each pleat that I measure, and I mark the chalk, that I have to sharpen this chalk periodically, because as the chalk dulls, these lines are going to get wider, and therefore my pleats are going to get wider. So there we are. So I'm going to have 29 pleats. They're going to measure 1/2 at the hip. They're going to be 3/4 plus. Incidentally, my shorthand with this is going to be 3/4. Because if I can do this in graduations, rather than having to have these things, a million of these things graduated in 16ths or 32nds, I've got a 3/4. 3/4 plus is the width of this plus the thickness of one chalk line. 3/4 plus plus is this thickness plus the thicknesses of 2 chalk lines. And I will double check that with my tape, counting out 16ths. But I've checked it and it's right. So I'm going to put my my measurement there. I'm going to sew that in place. So I've chalked the apron. I come to the first pleat, first and second pleat, and I've marked, and you notice I've done all of this before I've reduced the cloth, because once we rip the cloth and we have this raw edge, the more we handle it, the more yarns we're going to lose. This is very, very good cloth, so it's only going to lose a few yarns before it sort of self-seals. What I've done, so I'm going to do all my chalking before I rip it to length. So at the first pleat, I've just marked it with an X. The last pleat was also marked with an X. So I measure down, or I measure up, I should say, from the hem of the kilt. I mark, I measure 2.5 down from that, which will be the center of the strap hole, the buttonhole. And I measure, my fell is 7 inches, so I measure 7 inches down from that to there. Now what I've done is I take a buckle, because remember, or a strap, not a buckle. Working a little fast here. I've made that mark to show the center of the hole, so I line up my strap, and looking through the holes I can see the chalk line. So I go mark and mark. I do the second one, same way, and now my two sides of the buttonhole are marked, and I know when I'm sewing not to sew that. So with my gauges, I've marked the width at the hip, sorry, at the waist, hip, I'm looking at it backwards. I've marked at the hip and waist, and now I've done these on the last one as well. So now I can rip the cloth. So I'll put those away. This is a part that sometimes make people jump out of their head, because the best way to reduce this cloth is to rip a straight line, because we get an absolutely straight line. If you're using a scissor, no matter how careful you are, you're going to weave around with it. Now, I have measured and double checked so that I know that I'm right. I make a nip with my scissors. I grab the cloth and away we go. And this cloth is quite resistant to tearing. I'm having to exert myself with this stuff. In fact, several years ago, when I tore my rotator cuff, I was unable to do this because this cloth is so strong. I compare this to other kilt cloth I've dealt with, where with the merest of effort it sort of floats apart into two bits. So now I'm going to roll this spare piece, which is going to provide the top end. I'm going to roll that neatly up and put it to one side. I'm going to lay the tartan out neatly and fold it as you saw me do it earlier. And then I'm going to start sewing. So there we are. It's all, I'm just going to fold it neatly like this. And I'll be ready to start sewing. Incidentally, there's one part, because no matter how carefully I write down my lesson plan, there seems to be one thing I forget to mention, and that is how to choose what the apron is going to be centered on. And I'll do that with a customer. Usually, if it's pleated to the set, it's going to be the most common, the strongest element of the tartan, in this case the red stripe. If it's pleated to a stripe, the center element of the tartan will frequently be the same stripe as displayed in the pleats. But in this case, because it's going to be pleated to the white stripe, which is going to look very effective because the white stripe's divided between black on one side and green on the other. When we sew this, we're going to get a kind of a 3D popping effect. It's going to look very striking indeed. But what I did was, with the customer, you sit down and you go, okay, there's the center of the kilt. Because if you move it so that different blocks of color, different lines are centered on the pleat, or centered on the apron, it quite changes the effect. That it's even just that, you go a little bit, now it looks more green, now it looks more blue kind of thing. So so there we are. So I'm going to carry on, fold this one more time, pick up the needle and thread, and then basically work through the weekend, because this time next week, Chap's going to be here expecting his kilt ready for final fitting, and for him to take it away. Thank you.